The Texas sun in 1881 didn't just shine, it punished. It cooked the dust into the very bones of the market town, turning the air into a gritty, shimmering haze. Horses whinnied, their tails flicking at flies in a useless rhythm. Cattle bawled, a low, miserable sound that hung in the heat. And men with whiskey on their breath and desperation in their eyes, barked prices over the din, their worn boots kicking up clouds of red dirt. This was the last livestock auction of the season, a final chance to turn hide and bone into coin before winter came knocking. Silas Carrion stood apart from the noise, a man shaped by the vast, quiet emptiness of his own land. At 35, his face was a map of sun and wind, with lines etched around eyes that saw more than they let on. He rarely came to town. He preferred the company of his fences and the low murmur of his herd. But his best mare had gone lame, and a rancher without a solid horse was a man walking toward his own grave. He'd come for a horse, and nothing more. The auction was winding down. The good stock was gone, sold to ranchers with deeper pockets and louder voices. All that was left was the dregs. A crowd still lingered by one corral, not to bid, but to gawk. Inside, a bay mare stood trembling, her ribs a sharp ladder under her hide, her flanks scarred with the ghosts of old whippings. She was broken, and everyone knew it. Silas adjusted his hat, his gaze sweeping past the pathetic horse. And that's when he saw her. She was standing just behind the corral gate, a girl no older than 19. Her hair was a matted tangle of brown and dust, her dress torn at the hem, and her bare feet were cracked and stained by the earth. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. Her eyes, wide and dark, seemed to be watching something no one else could see, a phantom playing out in the heat waves. Beside her stood a man who smelled of stale liquor and regret. In one hand, he held a half-empty bottle. In the other, a rope. And the rope wasn't tied to the broken mare. It was tied to the girl's wrist. "Got a dumb one here," the drunk hollered, his voice a ragged tear in the air. "Came out of my first wife, I think. She don't talk, don't hear neither. Useless for most things, but she cooks and cleans and don't ever sass back." He gave the rope a vicious tug. "Cheap." A few men snickered, a low, ugly sound. One spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near the girl's feet. She didn't even flinch. Silas felt a familiar coil of disgust tighten in his gut. He started to turn away. This wasn't his business. He was here for a horse, a creature of simple needs and honest work. This girl, this situation. It was a complication he didn't want and couldn't afford. He took a step, then another, his boot heels thudding against the packed clay. But then he felt it. Not a sound, not a touch, just a look. He glanced back. The girl was staring right at him. Her unfocused gaze was gone. Now her eyes were locked onto his, and they were clear, still, and sharper than a shard of glass. There was no pleading in them, no desperation. There was just a flicker of recognition, as if she was looking at a mirror of her own solitude. The drunk stumbled toward him, seeing the direction of his gaze. You got coin. Want the mare? She's a good-for-nothing nag, but she's all I got left." He shoved the girl forward. "The girl comes with her. A package deal. I ain't dragging her back to my shack. Not worth the dust on her toes." Silas froze. The mare pawed at the ground, blowing froth from her nostrils. The crowd watched, their faces a mixture of pity and cruel amusement. He looked at the mare, then at the girl. Her eyes never left his. It was a silent challenge, a silent question. "What kind of man are you, Silas Carrion?" He didn't know it yet, but his answer wouldn't just change his life. It would unravel a secret that would shake the entire county to its core. A long moment passed. The sun beat down. The drunk swayed on his feet, a foul grin spreading across his face. "What's it gonna be, rancher? 2 for the price of 1. You buying livestock or starting a harem, Silas?" A voice jeered from the crowd. The laughter that followed was instant and crude. Silas ignored them. His world had narrowed to the space between him and the girl. He saw the faint, almost invisible bruises on her arms, the way she held herself perfectly still, like a wild animal trying not to be seen. He had come for a horse to ease his loneliness, but the loneliness he saw in her eyes was a chasm far deeper than his own. He reached into his pocket, his hand closing around the worn leather of his coin purse. He looked the drunk dead in the eye, his voice low and steady, cutting through the laughter like a cold wind. "I'll take both." He counted the coins into the drunk's grimy, outstretched palm. It was more than enough for the horse, but not nearly enough for a human soul. The man's eyes lit up with greed. "She's yours now," he slurred, yanking the rope toward Silas. But the girl did something unexpected. As the rope tightened, she flinched away from her captor and took a single, deliberate step to stand behind Silas. She used him as a shield. Instinctively, a tremor of shock went through Silas. It wasn't the move of a dumb one. It was the move of someone who could read a man's character in a single glance. "Don't say I didn't warn you," the drunk spat, already turning toward the saloon. "Ain't worth the feed she eats." Silas didn't answer. He untied the rough rope from her wrist, the fibers having chafed her skin raw. He tossed it into the dust. He then led the broken-down mare from the pen, the horse following him with a surprising trust. The girl walked behind him, her steps so soft on the hard-packed earth he could barely hear them. She held nothing in her hands, owned nothing but the torn dress on her back. When they reached his wagon, she stopped, waiting, still utterly silent. He opened the back and motioned for her to climb in. She did without hesitation, folding herself into the far corner, pulling her knees to her chest like someone used to being invisible. She found a small space between a sack of flour and a crate of tools and simply ceased to exist. As Silas climbed onto the driver's bench, he felt the faintest of tugs on the back of his coat. He looked down. Her fingers, small and calloused, had brushed his sleeve. Just once. It was so light he might have imagined it. When he turned, she wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the distant, hazy hills. But in that one fleeting touch, he felt it again. Not thanks, not a plea. It was an acknowledgement, a choice. She had chosen, in that single moment, to trust him. Silas Carrion, a man who spoke more with horses than with people, who lived alone on 200 acres of red Texas clay, with only his fences for company. A man with scars on his soul that he never, ever named. And now a girl who supposedly couldn't hear. A girl who, he was beginning to suspect, understood more than anyone had ever bothered to guess. He snapped the reins. The wagon creaked forward, its wheels crunching over the hardpan road leading out of town. Behind him, the girl sat curled beneath a spare blanket, her face turned to the wind. She never looked back. Neither did he. But if he had, he might have seen the single tear that traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. And he might have seen her other hand, hidden beneath the blanket, clutching a small, smooth object carved from dark wood. A tiny, perfect bird, its wings outstretched as if it were about to take flight. The journey to the ranch was long and quiet. The sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple, before finally sinking below the horizon. The world grew dark, and the only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft sigh of the wind through the mesquite trees. Silas didn't try to speak to her. What was the point? The drunk had said she was deaf, but Silas was a man who understood different kinds of silence. There was the peaceful silence of an open prairie at dawn. There was the heavy silence of a coming storm. And then there was the silence of this girl. It wasn't empty. It was watchful. It was listening. His ranch wasn't much. A simple house with a slanted porch, a sturdy barn, a few outbuildings, and a long, lonely stretch of prairie where his cattle grazed under an impossibly big sky. It was clean, it was quiet, and for a man like him, it had always been enough. Until now. He helped her down from the wagon, half expecting her to bolt into the darkness. But she didn't. She stepped lightly to the ground, her bare feet making no sound. Her eyes swept across the homestead, from the house to the barn to the distant line of hills. She wasn't frightened. She was cataloging, memorizing, understanding the layout of her new cage, or her new home. Silas wasn't sure which it was yet. Inside, the house was sparse and masculine. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, a bed in the corner. He pointed to the kettle and the water pump. She nodded, her eyes taking everything in. She moved toward the pump and began to work the handle with a smooth, practiced motion, like she'd been doing it her whole life. She found the tin cups, stoked the embers in the hearth back to life, and had a pot of water boiling without him saying a single word. She moved with an unnerving efficiency, a ghost in his home who already knew where everything was. After a simple supper of beans and hardtack, eaten in complete silence, Silas had an idea. He retrieved a piece of chalk from a drawer and tapped the wooden door frame next to the table. He looked at her and said the words slowly, over-enunciating like a fool. Name. She stared at him for a long, unblinking moment. He thought she didn't understand. He was about to give up when she took the chalk from his fingers. Her touch was surprisingly gentle. She knelt beside the frame, and with careful, deliberate strokes, she wrote a single word in a soft, slanted script. Emmeline. He read it once, then twice. Emmeline, he said aloud, testing the feel of it on his tongue. It felt foreign, soft. It didn't belong in his harsh, quiet world. She gave no smile, no sign that she'd heard. She simply placed the chalk on the table and walked out the door, disappearing into the darkness of the yard. Silas watched her go, a strange feeling prickling the back of his neck. He looked from the empty doorway back to the name on the wood. Emmeline. He didn't know why, but a cold knot of certainty was forming in his stomach. The drunk had lied. He had lied about everything. The next morning, Silas found her in the barn. She was crouched beside the beaten-down mare from the auction. The horse, which he'd named Mercy, hadn't eaten, and its back leg was swollen from an old untreated strain. Any other man would have put the horse out of its misery, but Emmeline was running a damp cloth down Mercy's flank. She wasn't speaking, not with words or signs. She was just there. Her hands moved in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Her breath was steady. It was like she was listening to the horse's pain with her entire body. Silas stood at the barn door, his arms crossed, expecting the mare to kick or bite. He'd seen seasoned ranch hands lose teeth for getting that close to a pained animal, but Mercy stood perfectly still, shuddering only slightly under Emmeline's touch. The girl then took some herbs she'd found growing by the well, herbs Silas had never even noticed, crushed them into a paste, and gently applied it to the swollen leg before wrapping it with a strip of clean cloth torn from her own tattered dress. Maybe she couldn't hear words, but she sure as hell could hear suffering. He decided to test her. He set out a list of chores, simple things. Muck out the stalls, mend a fence, wash the floorboards. He didn't write them down or use gestures. He just did the first few feet of each task himself, then left the tools and went about his own work. He watched her from a distance. She understood perfectly. She moved from one task to the next, her work swift and thorough. There was no complaint, no hesitation, no wasted motion. Each night he'd leave the chalk on the table, and each morning he'd find a new note scrawled on the doorframe. Not questions or requests, but observations. Bacon low, dog limping on front paw, wind smells like dust. They never spoke, but the silence in the house was changing. It was no longer empty. It was filled with her presence, with the small notes she left, with the quiet way she moved through his world. It was becoming a shared silence, and that made it more dangerous than he could possibly imagine, because Silas was starting to feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He was starting to feel not so alone, and for a man like him, that was a terrifying thing. The storm came without warning. It started like most Texas storms, with a lie. A hot, cloying breeze rose around sundown, brushing against the long prairie grass like a predator's warning breath. Silas glanced at the sky. A line of bruised-looking clouds was gathering on the western horizon, but he thought nothing of it. Storms were a part of life out here. You battened down the hatches and you rode it out. He was in the small cattle shed, checking on a newborn calf that was struggling to feed. The air was thick and heavy, charged with a strange energy. He was so focused on the calf, on the familiar rhythms of his work, that he didn't hear her approach. Suddenly she was there, a whirlwind in the doorway. Emmeline, barefoot, her hair wild around her face, her chest heaving. She grabbed his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong, and tugged. Hard. "What is it?" he asked, startled. He glanced outside. The sky was darker but not yet threatening. The storm's still a ways off. She shook her head frantically. Her eyes, wide with a terror he'd never seen before, said what her mouth could not. She pointed upward at the roof of the shed and then tugged him again, harder this time, toward the main barn, away from the open corral. There was a raw, primal urgency in her pull that defied logic. He hesitated. The calf was weak. He needed to. She didn't let him finish the thought. She got in front of him, placed her hands on his chest, and pushed him backward, step by step, out of the shed. Her face was a mask of desperate concentration. It was the most animated he had ever seen her. And then it happened. It wasn't a crack of thunder. It was a shatter. The world split in two. A bolt of lightning, jagged and blindingly white, dropped from the heavens like the wrath of God. It didn't strike the open field. It didn't strike the tall windmill. It struck the ancient, looming oak tree that stood right behind the cattle shed, the very spot where he had been standing seconds before. The blast was deafening. It shook the earth, throwing Silas off his balance. The oak tree exploded, bursting into a column of flame and splinters. It collapsed with a groan that sounded like the sky itself was weeping, its flaming branches crashing down onto the roof of the cattle shed, which immediately caught fire. Silas stumbled back, his ears ringing, his eyes wide with disbelief. The calves inside the burning shed bleated in terror. Smoke and the smell of ozone filled the air. He looked at her. Emmeline stood just outside the doorway, her face illuminated by the flickering fire. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly, but her eyes were steady. She wasn't surprised. She was relieved. She had known. It wasn't a guess. She hadn't just sensed the change in the air. She had known where the lightning would strike before it happened. Before the thunder. Before the first drop of rain. He walked toward her slowly, his mind struggling to catch up with what he had just witnessed. "How did you—" The words died on his lips. She just looked at him, her silent, certain gaze telling him everything and nothing at all. That night, after they'd put out the fire and calmed the animals, they sat at the kitchen table. The burned shell of the shed was a dark scar against the night sky. He didn't offer her the chalk. Words felt small, useless. He just sat there, his hands flat on the wooden table, his heart still hammering against his ribs. She had saved his life. This strange, silent girl had saved his life. He realized for the first time in years that he wasn't just not alone. He was being watched over. He looked at her hands folded in her lap. "Emmeline," he said again, his voice raspy. She lifted her eyes to meet his. Her silence answered him, and in that quiet, a terrifying new reality began to dawn on Silas. The drunk hadn't just lied about her being deaf. He'd lied to protect himself. He hadn't sold her because she was useless. He'd sold her because he was afraid of her, and now for the first time Silas was too. After the storm, the silence in the house changed again. It was no longer watchful or shared. It was heavy with unspoken questions. Silas started paying attention, not with suspicion, but with the wary curiosity of a man who'd lived by the predictable rules of sun and soil, and now found himself living with a miracle he couldn't explain. Emily never spoke. She rarely wrote more than her simple one-word observations on the doorframe, but her understanding of the world around her was deep and unsettling. It went beyond instinct. It was a form of knowledge that had no name. One morning, the lead cow of his herd, a stout Hereford named Bessie, stood alone in the pasture, not eating. Silas chalked it up to a chill in the air. He made a mental note to keep an eye on her, but Emmeline moved without hesitation. Silas watched from the porch as she walked out to the pasture. She didn't approach Bessie. Instead, she went straight to the birthing stall in the barn, a stall that hadn't been used in months. She filled it with fresh straw, drew a bucket of clean water, and mixed in mint leaves from the small herb patch she'd cultivated behind the house. Only then did she go to the cow, stroking its belly in slow, measured circles and gently guiding it toward the barn. By sunset, Bessie was in labor, delivering a healthy calf. She had known. Somehow she had known the cow was pregnant and that the birth was imminent, even when Silas, who had worked this herd his entire life, had seen nothing. He said nothing, but he watched her, and the fear in his gut was slowly being replaced by something else. Awe. The next day he rode into town for supplies, his mind still reeling. The weight of his own history felt heavier than usual. The sheriff stopped him on the street, his eyes shifting nervously. There were whispers, he said. Rumors about old land claims. Whispers that Silas's father, a hard and unforgiving man, had taken more than was rightfully his during the chaos after the war. Bloodshed, relocation, guilt. It was an old story, a ghost that haunted Silas's land, but the whispers never truly went away. He returned to the ranch with the sheriff's warnings churning in his stomach. He didn't speak a word of it to Emmeline. He unhitched the wagon and sat on the front step, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard, and let the familiar shame wash over him. Shame for what his father had done to keep this land. After a few minutes, the screen door creaked open. Emmeline came and stood beside him. She didn't look at him. She just stood there, a silent sentinel against the falling dusk. Then she did something that made the air leave his lungs. She placed her hand on his shoulder. It was light as a breeze, but as steady as the earth beneath his feet. It was a gesture of pure comfort, of understanding. A dam inside him broke. The words tumbled out, a low, bitter mutter he didn't intend to speak. How can you know? How can you know I feel shame over this land? Shame for what my father did? Emmeline's dark eyes searched his face. She didn't answer with a note or a sign. Instead, she slowly lifted her hand from his shoulder and placed it flat against his chest, right over his heart. Her touch was warm. She held it there for a long moment, as if listening to the frantic, guilty rhythm of it. Then she turned and walked toward the old oak tree at the edge of the property, the one that had been struck by lightning, the same tree that shaded the simple, unmarked stone where his father was buried. She had never been to that grave. He had never told her who was buried there. She had never asked. And yet she knew. That night, Silas was ripped from sleep by a nightmare. Cannon fire and scorched hills. His father's voice, rough and proud, echoing through the smoke. I gave you this land, Silas. I gave you the blood on it, too. He sat bolt upright, gasping for breath, his heart pounding a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. The silence of the room felt suffocating. And then he saw her. Emmeline was sitting in the chair by the cold hearth. She had lit a single candle, and in its flickering golden light, her profile looked as if it were carved from shadow and grace. On the table beside the candle was a small object, a blue handkerchief faded with age, trimmed with delicate, hand-stitched lace. It was his mother's. Silas hadn't seen it in over a decade. He kept it locked away in a cedar chest at the foot of his bed. A chest he never opened, a chest no one else had ever touched. He stared at it, then at her. The question was a silent scream in his mind. How? Emmeline didn't look at him. She simply rose, blew out the candle, and walked to the door of the small room he had given her. She didn't need to explain. She hadn't just found the key. She hadn't just opened the chest. She had heard his nightmare. She had heard the silent scream of his grief, the aching weight of guilt that he carried for both his mother's gentleness and his father's sins. And in her quiet, profound way, she had answered him. She had brought him the one thing that represented a comfort he thought he had lost forever. And for the first time in his life, Silas wasn't afraid for his land, or his legacy, or even his own soul. He was afraid of losing the one person in the entire world who knew what he felt before he ever said a word. He was afraid of the silence that would return if she ever left, because her silence was the only thing that had ever truly hurt him. Fear, Silas learned, travels faster than gossip in a small town, and the fear surrounding Emmeline started as a whisper. It came from the blacksmith's wife, a woman with a tongue as sharp as a newly forged steel. She stares too long at the cattle, she said to a friend over a fence post, her voice low, like she knows which one is going to fall next. A week later, it was the preacher's son. She touched our prize goat, he told a circle of wide-eyed boys at the creek. Just laid her hand on its side. 2 days later, it gave birth to a stillborn kid. That ain't natural. No one had ever heard Emmeline speak a word, and the less she said, the more the town filled the silence with their own dark stories. Witch, cursed, devil-touched. The words clung to her like burrs. At the general store, a mother pulled her child behind her skirt when Emmeline walked past, even though she was only there to fetch flour. At the post office, someone spat on the ground near her feet. She never flinched, never reacted. But Silas saw it. He saw the way her fingers curled tighter around her basket, the way her footsteps became even quieter, as if she were trying to leave no impression on an earth that was rejecting her. He wanted to rage. He wanted to ride into town and demand they treat her with the decency she deserved. But he knew it would only make things worse. Fear isn't a rational thing. You can't fight it with fists or with logic. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. A boy from a neighboring ranch, the son of a hard-working hand named Miller, came down with a burning fever. His skin was red, his breathing was shallow, and he was lost in a violent seizure. The town doctor was miles away, dealing with a typhoid outbreak in the next county. The boy's mother was frantic. People whispered that it was God's will. It was not the doctor who came. It was Emmeline. She appeared at the Miller's small cabin as if summoned by the boy's suffering. Silas had no idea how she even knew. She moved softly into the dim room where the child lay on a cot, his small body trembling. She didn't ask permission. She merely knelt beside him, her face a mask of intense focus. She placed one cool hand on the boy's forehead and the other on his chest. She closed her eyes. For a long minute, she was perfectly still, as if listening to the fever itself. The boy's seizing began to subside. When she opened her eyes, she walked outside, went directly to the wall of Silas's barn where he dried herbs, and selected 3 kinds without hesitation: lavender, feverfew, and rabbit tobacco. She returned to the cabin, steeped the leaves in hot water, and gently coaxed the boy to drink the bitter tea. He drank, and he slept. By sunrise, the fever was gone. The boy was sitting up, weak but smiling, asking for a piece of cornbread. His mother wept, clutching Emmeline's hand with trembling gratitude. But gratitude, like milk, can sour quickly in a climate of fear. The very next day, the same mother was heard whispering at the town well. She never asked what was wrong with him. She just knew. She knew what herbs to use. How could she know that? How? The fear was no longer a whisper. It was a growl. 3 days later, they came for her. They came at dusk, a grim procession of 8 men and 4 women, their faces hard and set in the fading light. They carried torches, unlit, but held like promises of violence. They stood at the gate of Silas's ranch, their boots kicking up dust, their collective silence more menacing than any shout. The oldest among them, a man named Withers, whose own bitterness had curdled his soul, stepped forward. "We want her gone, Carrion," he said, his voice flat and cold. "That girl, she hears things she ought not to." Silas stood on his porch, his arms folded across his chest. He hadn't shaved in days, and his face was as hard as the timber framing of his house. "She's mute," he stated simply. "That ain't the same as deaf." Withers snapped, his voice rising. "She sees what's coming before the sky even knows it's going to rain. She talks to animals and they listen. A prize steer of mine dropped dead last week, not 2 hours after she walked past my fence line. You think that's a coincidence?" "She's a curse," a woman in the back shouted. A murmur of agreement rippled through the grim crowd. Inside the house, Silas could see Emmeline's silhouette behind the thin curtain of the window. She had heard the crunch of gravel under their boots. She had seen their faces, twisted not with simple hate, but with something far worse, righteous certainty. She started to move toward the door, to face them, but Silas held up a hand, a silent command to stay put. He stepped off the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, and faced them squarely. "She saved the Miller boy's life." "Or maybe," Withers countered, his eyes glinting, "she's the one who gave him the fever in the first place. A test, to show us her power." The accusation hung in the air, vile and poisonous. Silas felt a hot surge of fury, but he forced it down. He let the silence stretch, meeting each of their gazes one by one. "I have lived on this land for 35 years, he said, his voice low, but carrying with an unshakable authority that made them lean in to listen. "And in all that time, I can count on one hand the number of people who have ever truly heard me. Not just my words, my silences, my regrets, the grief I carry for my father's sins." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle over them. She heard all of it, without me ever saying a single damn thing. She doesn't listen with her ears. She listens with her hands, with her breath, with her whole soul. He took another step closer, his eyes boring into Withers. You want to run someone off for being different? For seeing a truth about the world that you're too blind or too scared to face? Fine. He planted his feet firmly. But you'll have to go through me first. The crowd stilled. Withers opened his mouth, then closed it again, sputtering. No one moved. The conviction in Silas's voice, the raw truth of it, had struck a chord of shame in some of them. They saw not a monster handler, but a man defending his own heart. Slowly, one by one, they began to disperse. The torches remained unlit. Their boots were heavy with defeat as they shuffled back down the long road to town. That night, the ranch was silent, except for the whisper of the wind. Inside, Emmeline placed a pot of cider on the hearth to warm. She moved beside Silas at the table where he sat, staring into the fire. She didn't sign, didn't write, didn't even look at him. But after a moment, she reached out and rested her fingers on the back of his hand. It was not a gesture of thanks. It was one of recognition, of a shared battle won. He turned his palm upward, his calloused fingers gently curling around hers, and together in the stillness of the house, they listened to the crackle of the wood, the hush of the night, and the silent, unbreakable bond growing between two souls who had never needed words to speak the truth. But as he held her hand, Silas noticed something for the first time. A small, faded scar on the inside of her wrist, shaped almost like a brand. It was a perfect circle with a jagged line through the middle. He frowned. It wasn't from the rope. This was old, and it looked disturbingly like the same cattle brand used by one of the most powerful and ruthless ranchers in the next county. A man known for cruelty, a man Silas's own father had warned him to never ever cross. The townsfolk were the least of his worries. The real threat hadn't even shown its face yet. The first snowfall of December came quietly, laying a clean white blanket over all that was broken and burned. The world outside the cabin windows grew soft and silent, and for a while there was peace. Inside, that peace was taking root. Emmeline sat by the window most days, her fingers busy. She was stitching together a cloak for him from scraps of old fabric, leather patches, wool cuffs, the lining from a coat he no longer wore. She worked without a pattern, her stitches small and perfect. She didn't need to hear the wind howl to know the heart of winter was coming. Silas watched her. In the weeks since the confrontation with the town, a new rhythm had settled over his ranch, a rhythm dictated by her quiet purpose. She brewed coffee before the sky turned gray. She brushed the horses in slow, soothing circles, training the yearlings with gentle hand gestures that worked better than any rope or spur. Animals trusted her in a way he'd never seen. A skittish foal would approach her if she simply stood still, hand outstretched, and waited. The silence of his life no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like listening. But the image of that strange scar on her wrist gnawed at him. The brand of the Rocking R Ranch. The ranch owned by Jedediah Thorne, a man who ruled his territory with an iron fist and was rumored to have a darkness in him as vast as the Texas plains. What connection could Emmeline possibly have to a man like that? One late afternoon, Silas rode out to the western ridge to check his fences before a storm they both knew was on its way. The light was fading fast, the air turning sharp and cold. He was distracted, his mind turning over the puzzle of Emmeline's past, when his horse suddenly shied. A loose rock, a scent on the wind. He never knew what caused it. The horse reared, and he was thrown hard, his shoulders slamming against the frozen earth. The breath was knocked from his chest in a painful rush. For a moment, all he could feel was a white-hot pulse of pain where his arm had struck a jutting tree root. He staggered to his feet, blood seeping from a deep gash in his elbow, his vision swimming. He tried to walk, but a sharp, stabbing pain in his ribs with each step told him something was broken. The sky was turning a deep, bruised purple. The first flakes of snow began to fall. His horse, spooked, was gone. He was miles from home, injured, and a blizzard was closing in. He wrapped a strip of cloth from his shirt around his bleeding arm and started to stumble in the direction of the ranch, but the snow was coming faster now, a blinding white curtain erasing the world. He didn't know how long he walked. An hour? 2, the cold was seeping into his bones, the pain in his side, a constant grinding agony. He fell once, then twice. The third time, he didn't have the strength to get back up. He curled himself at the base of a pine tree, the world dissolving into a swirl of white and black. This is it, he thought, a strange sense of calm settling over him. This is how it ends. He closed his eyes. He woke to a touch, a hand on his cheek, impossibly warm in the freezing air. He blinked his eyes open. Emmeline was kneeling over him, her face dusted with snow, her expression one of fierce, desperate concentration. She had a lantern in one hand, its golden light a beacon in the blizzard. How had she found him? There were no tracks. The wind was howling, covering any sound. It was impossible. She would have had to walk in a straight line, directly to this one tree in 1,000 acres of wilderness. She had felt it. She had felt his pain, his desperation, across the miles. She had known. She helped him to his feet, her small frame surprisingly strong as she supported his weight. The journey back was a blur of pain and biting wind, with Emmeline as his anchor, his guide through the white chaos. She got him inside, sat him by the hearth, and stripped the frozen bloody cloth from his wound. Her brow furrowed as she worked, her fingers gentle but sure. She cleaned the gash, pressed a poultice of yarrow and pine sap against it, remedies he didn't even know she knew, and wrapped it tightly. Then she tended to his ribs, her hands hovering over his side as if she could feel the break beneath the skin. He watched her, his teeth chattering from the cold, his mind numb with shock and awe. "You always know," he whispered, the words barely audible over the storm. She met his eyes. Then she did something that stopped his heart. She lifted his injured hand, the one that wasn't wrapped, and gently pressed her lips to the back of it, a soft, warm touch against his cold skin. It wasn't a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of reverence, a silent acknowledgement of the life that flowed through him, a life she had refused to let go of. The fire crackled. The room seemed to hold its breath. Something shifted between them, a door opening in the quiet space they shared. Later, as the blizzard raged outside, dusting the window panes with a thick layer of white, Silas sat across from her at the table. His body ached, but his mind was clear. He took a piece of paper from his desk and a pencil and wrote slowly, carefully, each letter shaped with a meaning that could not be spoken aloud. He turned the paper to face her. It read, "I want to hear your heart if you'll let me listen with mine." She looked at the words for a long, long time. Her fingers reached out and touched them one by one, as if to feel the truth inside the ink. When she finally raised her eyes to his, they were glistening with unshed tears. She reached across the table, her small hand covering his. And then, for the first time since she had entered his life, she smiled. It wasn't a polite smile, or one born of fear or thanks. It was a smile like a sunrise, like something breaking free after being held captive for a lifetime. Outside, the wind howled its fury, but inside that small cabin, a silence deeper than words had finally found its voice. It was warm, and it was real, and it was theirs. And as he smiled back, Silas made a silent vow. He would protect her. He would protect this peace. He would find out what the brand on her wrist meant, and he would face Jedediah Thorne himself if he had to. He would burn the whole world down before he let anyone take her from him. Winter softened. The blizzard was the season's last great rage, and in its wake, the days grew longer, the light gentler. Between Silas and Emmeline, something new was being built, piece by quiet piece. She began to teach him her language, not just gestures, but a true language of the hands: water, fire, horse, home. Her fingers moved like birds in flight, elegant and precise. He was clumsy, his own hands thick and calloused from years of hard labor. But she was endlessly patient. She would take his hands in hers, guiding his fingers until he formed the signs correctly. She never laughed at his mistakes. He, in turn, taught her to ride. She'd never been on a horse before, not properly. The first time she clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white, but he walked beside her, his hand on her leg, speaking low words of encouragement even though he knew she couldn't hear them. It didn't matter. She felt the vibration of his voice, the rhythm of the horse's gait through her bones, and soon she was riding with a natural grace that left him breathless. They were a strange pair, the silent man learning to speak with his hands and the silent girl learning to trust the world from the back of a horse. But the shadow of the rocking R brand and the man named Thorn was always there in the back of Silas's mind. He started asking quiet questions when he went to town for supplies. He'd mentioned Thorn's name casually to the blacksmith, to the general store owner. The reactions were always the same. A flicker of fear in their eyes, a sudden busyness, a change of subject. Thorn was a man people were afraid to even talk about. He learned that Thorn's wife had died in childbirth many years ago, and that Thorn had become even more reclusive and cruel since. He learned that Thorn had a daughter, but no one had seen her in years. Some said she'd run away. Some said she was sickly and kept hidden away at the ranch. Some whispered she was simple-minded, an embarrassment to her powerful father. A daughter no one had seen in years, a girl about Emmeline's age. A cold dread began to coil in Silas's stomach. The new threat didn't come with the wind or the rain. It came with the smell of smoke on a moonless night. Silas was woken from a deep sleep by a hand on his shoulder. Emmeline. Her eyes were wide in the darkness, and she was signing frantically, her hands a blur. Fire. Barn. Now. He was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his boots. Outside, the night was still, but a faint orange glow was licking at the edges of the barn roof. He grabbed a bucket, Emmeline right behind him with another. The horses were thrashing in their stalls, panicked by the smell of smoke. The fire wasn't big yet, just a small blaze near the hayloft, but it was growing fast. Emmeline didn't scream or cry. She moved through the chaos like a calming spirit, touching each horse's flank, her silent presence seeming to soothe their terror. A loud creak echoed from above. Silas looked up. A heavy beam, already scorched and groaning under the heat, was about to give way. "We have to move them!" he yelled, his voice raw with smoke and urgency. But she was already leading Mercy out, signing quickly as she went. "Roof will fall. Now!" Together they worked in a frantic, synchronized rhythm born of their shared silence. He would unlatch a stall, and she would be there to lead the animal out to the safety of the corral. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. Just as the last horse, a terrified yearling, cleared the barn door, the north beam gave way with a deafening crash. The roof caved in, sending a shower of sparks and flaming debris down on the very spot where they had just stood. They stumbled back, chests heaving, faces black with soot. Silas turned to Emmeline. She stood watching the barn burn, her hair soaked from the water they'd thrown, her body trembling not from fear, but from adrenaline. He looked at the fire. It hadn't started near the lantern. It had started in the hayloft, where there was no source of ignition. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. She touched her chest. Then she pointed not to the sky, but down the long, dark road that led away from their ranch. He understood. She hadn't sensed a storm. She had sensed him, the person who had set the fire. She had felt his malice, his presence in the dark. Later, huddled in the cabin, the roaring fire of the burning barn their only light, he took her hand. He spelled it out slowly with the signs she had taught him. "You belong here, with me." She smiled, a sad, knowing smile. She placed his hand on her chest, over her heart. For the first time, he felt its rhythm. Not quiet, not steady. It was hammering, a frantic, frightened beat. She wasn't just afraid for their home. She was afraid of who was coming for her. And in that moment, Silas knew with a chilling certainty. Emmeline wasn't her real name. The drunk wasn't her father. She was the lost daughter of Jedediah Thorne, and her father was coming to take her back. The fire changed them. The shared danger, the frantic race against the flames, had forged their bond into something harder than steel. But it also brought the world crashing in. The smoke from their burning barn was a signal, and the story of the accidental fire spread through the county. It brought an unexpected consequence. It brought people, not with torches this time, but with hesitant footsteps and downcast eyes. The story of the fire, and how Silas and the mute girl had saved every single animal, had shifted something in the town's perception. Their fear was being replaced by a grudging respect. The first was Tom Weaver, the ranch hand whose boy Emmeline had saved. His own barn had a dangerously rotten beam, and he didn't know how to fix it. He arrived one gray morning, hat in hand. "Heard you had some bad luck," he said to Silas, "but also heard you're a hell of a builder. Wondered if I could pay you for a day's work." It was an apology, wrapped in a job offer. Silas agreed, and while he was at the Weaver Ranch, Tom's wife sent over a freshly baked pie and a hand-knitted scarf. "For the girl," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "The one who hears more than we do." A few days later, a widow came. Her husband had died a month prior, and she hadn't slept a full night since, tormented by grief. She came to the ranch and just sat on the porch step, weeping quietly. Emmeline came out, sat beside her, and simply held her hand. They sat like that for an hour as dusk settled. Not a word exchanged. The next morning the woman returned. She told Silas she had slept through the night for the first time in weeks. The winter passed with fewer whispers, fewer names spat in fear. Some townsfolk still crossed the street to avoid them, but most now offered a hesitant nod or a tipped hat. Small gifts of preserves or smoked meat would sometimes appear by their gate in the morning. Emmeline started writing a message on a small chalkboard Silas nailed beside the kitchen door. Every morning, a new sentence. "Today will be good. I can feel it." Sometimes she was wrong, but most days she was right. And slowly, people began to believe it. Then came the Sunday that changed everything forever. The frost had just lifted from the ground. The church bell was ringing, its clear notes echoing across the hills. And then, before the echo faded, a second sound replaced it. The frantic ringing of a different bell, the one reserved for emergencies. Panic spread through the town like a wildfire. A 7-year-old boy, the grandson of the preacher, had vanished. He'd been helping with morning chores and had wandered off toward the tree line. They'd found one of his small boots stuck in the mud near the creek. Nothing more. Men on horseback shouted, mothers cried, dogs barked in a frenzy. A search party was forming, a chaotic, desperate mob. Silas reached for his coat. He had to help, but Emmeline, already beside him, placed a hand on his arm. She shook her head. Then she knelt down, right there in their yard. She pressed her hands flat against the earth, palms, wrists, her entire forearms. She closed her eyes, her body perfectly still, her face a mask of utter concentration. It was like she was listening to the ground itself, feeling the vibrations of the boy's fear, the echo of his lost footsteps. After a full minute, her eyes snapped open. She stood up, a new certainty in her posture. She didn't look at the search party fanning out toward the east. She looked west, toward the rocky, treacherous ridges that no one ever went near. She stood and walked. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She just knew he would be. And they did follow. First Silas, then Tom Weaver, who had come to see if they needed help. Then others peeled off from the main search party, their curiosity piqued by the strange, silent girl's unwavering confidence. They followed her through thickets of thorn brush, up steep, rocky inclines, and down into dry creek beds. She never slowed, never hesitated. She moved as if an invisible thread was pulling her forward. Finally, in a clearing surrounded by a ring of ancient cedar trees, she stopped, and they saw him. The boy was curled beneath a bent tree, his face streaked with dirt and tears, his ankle swollen and bent at an unnatural angle. He was alive. Emmeline ran to him. She knelt, her hands gently checking his leg, brushing the matted hair from his eyes. She whispered to him, not with words but with the calming energy that flowed from her. The boy's panicked sobs quieted. When the boy was carried back to town, safe, and the story was retold, no one called her a witch. No one called her strange. They called her what she truly was, the girl who hears with her heart. But as the town celebrated, a lone rider watched from a distant hill. He wore a dark coat and sat atop a powerful black stallion, the rocking R brand clear on its flank. He had not come for the search. He had come for the girl. He had seen her display her gift in the most public way possible. He now knew for certain. After all these years, he had found his daughter. He turned his horse around and rode hard, not back to his ranch, but east, toward the office of the circuit judge, a man who owed Jedediah Thorne more than a few favors. He wasn't going to take his daughter back by force. He was going to use the law. He was going to have her declared his property, and he was going to have Silas Carrion arrested for kidnapping. The town had finally accepted Emmeline, but the world was about to try and tear her away. The legal notice arrived a week later, delivered by a grim-faced sheriff's deputy who wouldn't meet Silas's eye. It was cold, formal, and brutal. A petition had been filed with the circuit court by Mr. Jedediah Thorne. It claimed that the mute girl living in Silas's care was, in fact, his long-lost daughter, Elara Thorne, who had been abducted as a child. It accused Silas of kidnapping and holding her against her will. A hearing was set for the end of the month. The news hit the town like a physical blow. The people who had just begun to embrace Emmeline were now thrown into confusion and fear. Jedediah Thorne was a name that commanded respect and terror in equal measure. To go against him was to invite ruin. Silas read the document, his hands shaking with a rage so pure it felt like ice in his veins. Elara. Her name was Elara. He looked at Emmeline, who was watching him from across the room, her dark eyes filled with a sorrow he now understood. She had known this day would come. He knelt in front of her and signed, his movements sharp and angry. "Is it true? Is he your father?" She hesitated, her own hands trembling. Then she signed back, a story tumbling from her fingers in a rush of silent words. Yes, he was her father. Her mother, who had the same gift of knowing, had died giving birth to her. Her father had seen their ability not as a gift, but as a curse, an unnatural taint on his bloodline. He kept her isolated, hidden away, punishing her for every premonition, every moment she knew something she shouldn't. The drunk at the market hadn't been her father. He had been a sympathetic ranch hand her father had paid to get rid of her, to sell her like cattle, to make her disappear so he could be free of the witch he had sired. The brand on her wrist was from when she was a child. Her father had done it himself to mark her as his property, a thing he owned and could discard at will. Silas's heart broke. The years of cruelty she must have endured. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. She buried her face in his shoulder, and for the first time, he felt her body shake with silent sobs. "He won't take you," Silas whispered into her hair. "I won't let him." But Thorne was a powerful man, and Silas was just one rancher with a small piece of land. The law was on Thorne's side. A father's claim was absolute. The day of the hearing arrived, gray and cold. The entire town seemed to be there, crammed into the small courthouse. Jedediah Thorne sat at the front, a mountain of a man in an expensive suit, his face like carved granite. He had a team of slick lawyers from the city beside him. Silas sat on the other side with Emmeline. He had no lawyer. He only had the truth. Thorne's lawyers presented their case. They produced documents, a birth certificate for Elara Thorne. They painted a picture of a heartbroken father who had spent years searching for his lost, simple-minded daughter, only to find her in the clutches of a lonely, manipulative rancher. When it was Silas's turn, the judge looked down at him with disdain. "Mr. Carrion, do you have any evidence to refute Mr. Thorne's claim to his own daughter?" Silas stood up, his voice steady. "She is not his property. She is a person, and she doesn't want to go with him." He turned to Emmeline. "Tell them," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Show them." But Emmeline was frozen, her eyes locked on her father. The terror of her childhood had returned, paralyzing her. Her hands were clenched in her lap. She couldn't sign. She couldn't speak. Thorne allowed himself a small, cruel smile. It was over. He had won. The judge cleared his throat, ready to deliver his verdict. "In the absence of any testimony from the girl herself—" "Wait." The voice came from the back of the courtroom. It was quiet, but it cut through the tense silence. Everyone turned. Tom Weaver, the ranch hand, was standing, his hat clutched in his hands. "That girl," he said, his voice gaining strength, "she saved my boy's life. She didn't use no witchcraft. She used knowledge and kindness." Then another voice, the widow. "She sat with me in my grief. She didn't say a word, but she heard my heart breaking. Suddenly others were standing. The blacksmith, the preacher's wife. One by one, the people of the town, the very people who had once scorned her, began to speak. They told the court about the warnings of storms, the healed animals, the found child. They weren't speaking of witchcraft anymore. They were speaking of a gift. They were testifying to her character, building a wall of support around her with their words. Thorne's face darkened with rage. He hadn't counted on this. He hadn't counted on the community that had formed around his discarded daughter. The judge, seeing the tide of opinion turning, looked flustered. This is all anecdotal. It does not change the legal fact of paternity. Just then, Emmeline moved. She stood up, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She walked past Silas, past the lawyers, and stood directly in front of the judge's bench. She looked at her father, then at the judge. And then she did the one thing no one, not even Silas, ever expected. She spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was rusty from years of disuse, soft as a leaf falling on snow. But it was clear, and every single person in that courtroom heard it. "He is not my father," she whispered. "A father does not burn a brand into his daughter's skin." She held up her wrist, showing the scar to the stunned courtroom. "A father does not sell his child because he fears her." She turned her gaze to Silas, and her expression softened. "My home is with the man who taught me that my silence was not a weakness, the man who listened to my heart." She then looked back at Thorne, her eyes blazing with a strength he had never seen. "I am not Ilara Thorne. My name is Emmeline." A collective gasp went through the room. Thorne lunged to his feet, his face purple with fury. "She's lying. The girl is a witch. She's addled your minds." But it was too late. The sight of the brand, combined with the testimony of the town and Emmeline's own quiet, powerful words, had shattered his case. The judge, a politician above all else, saw which way the wind was blowing. He slammed his gavel down. Petition denied. The courtroom erupted. Thorne, defeated and humiliated, stormed out, vowing revenge. But Silas didn't see him go. He was only looking at Emmeline, who was walking back toward him, a real smile, a free smile on her face. He met her halfway, and in the middle of the crowded courtroom, he took her in his arms. The townspeople, their friends, closed in around them, not with torches and fear, but with applause and acceptance. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had given the entire town a lesson in how to listen. Years passed, soft and quiet as the falling snow. The ranch still stood, weathered and wiser, wrapped in the steady rhythm of a life built not on words, but on understanding. The story of the mute girl who spoke the truth in the courtroom became a local legend, a tale told to children about the power of a quiet heart. Jedediah Thorne, his power broken by public humiliation, lost his land and his influence, and faded into bitter obscurity. He was a ghost of the past, his threats empty and powerless against the life Silas and Emmeline had built. They never had children of their own, but their home was never empty. Children from the town, from the surrounding ranches, were drawn to the quiet woman who could calm a spooked horse with a touch and who knew where the sweetest wild berries grew. Emmeline taught them to listen, not just with their ears, but with their whole beings. She taught them to see the stories written in a crooked branch, to feel a coming rain on the wind, to understand the shy language of a wild creature. Silas built a wooden bench beneath the old cottonwood tree, and that's where they sat most evenings, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun bleed into the hills. He would play old tunes on a worn harmonica, and she would lean her head on his shoulder, feeling the music vibrate through him. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. Their silence was a language all its own, rich with shared history and a love that had weathered every storm. One evening, as the shadows stretched long across the prairie, Emmeline turned to him. Her voice, though still soft, was stronger now, more confident. "I do not need sound," she whispered, her fingers tracing the lines on his hand. "Only you." Silas blinked back the tightness in his throat. He leaned over and kissed her temple. "I hear you," he answered, his own voice thick with emotion. "Always have." They stayed like that until the last light faded from the sky. Two souls who had found each other in the vast Texas silence. Theirs was a love story that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It was a story that was lived every single day in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. And sometimes, that's the truest kind of love there is. If your heart has ever paused for a gaze that understood without words, if you believe that the deepest connections are the ones that don't need a voice to be heard, then the story of Silas and Emmeline was meant for you. They prove that listening isn't done with the ears, but with the soul. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If you were moved by their story of courage and quiet love, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of love, justice, and the unspoken truths of the human heart. Every story we tell is a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of worlds, the bravest thing you can be is kind. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, may your quiet moments be full, and may you always find someone who hears the heart you carry.